The morning sun painted the Texas plains in shades of gold and amber as Maria, a running wolf, stepped onto the wooden porch of her small farmhouse. Her weathered hands gripped a steaming cup of coffee, the bitter warmth a small comfort against the growing chill of autumn. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to survive in a world that never quite accepted her. Maria was not like the other women who had settled in this harsh corner of Texas. Her father had been a Comanche warrior, her mother a Mexican woman taken during a raid, and later freed when she chose to stay with the tribe. Maria's bronze skin and dark eyes told the story of her mixed heritage, a heritage that made her an outsider in both worlds, yet gave her skills that few possessed. 3 years had passed since her husband Samuel, a gentle Irish farmer, had died from a fever that swept through the county. The other settlers had expected her to pack up and leave, to disappear back into whatever wilderness they imagined had spawned her. Instead, Maria had rolled up her sleeves and proven she could work the land as well as any man. She could track a wounded deer for miles, shoot a rifle with deadly accuracy, and read the signs of weather and wildlife that most folks missed entirely. Her farm was modest but well-maintained. 50 acres of good, grazing land supported a small herd of cattle, while her vegetable garden provided enough food to trade in town for supplies she couldn't make herself. The barn housed 2 sturdy horses, Chief and Thunder, both trained in the Comanche way to respond to subtle signals and to run silent when needed. Most people saw only a widow struggling to maintain a hardscrabble farm, but Maria had built something more precious than they realized. On this particular morning, something felt wrong. The birds were too quiet, and the cattle had bunched together near the far fence instead of spreading out to graze as they normally did. Maria's grandfather had taught her to listen to the voice of the land, to notice when the natural rhythm was disturbed. She set down her coffee and walked to the edge of the porch, scanning the horizon with eyes that missed nothing. In the distance, she spotted a thin column of smoke rising from the direction of the Henderson place, 5 miles to the east. It was too late in the morning for cooking fires, and the smoke was too thick and black. Maria felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had heard rumors of cattle rustlers operating in the area, men who took what they wanted and left destruction in their wake. She went back into the house and opened the wooden chest beside her bed. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, lay her most precious possessions. Her grandfather's war lance, adorned with eagle feathers and painted symbols that told the story of his victories. Her father's knife, its bone handle worn smooth by years of use. And her own weapons, the ones Samuel had helped her practice with behind the barn where the neighbors couldn't see. Maria strapped on her gun belt, checking that her Colt revolver was loaded and secure. She pulled on her father's buckskin jacket, its fringed sleeves allowing for easy movement while providing protection from thorns and brush. Over her dark hair, she tied a red bandana that had been her mother's, a reminder of the strength that flowed in her blood. Before leaving the house, she paused at the small shrine she had built in the corner of the main room. Photographs of Samuel and her parents sat beside Comanche medicine bundles and a wooden cross, representing the different paths that had shaped her life. She whispered a prayer in Spanish, then added a few words in Comanche, asking the spirits to guide her steps and protect her home. Maria saddled Chief, her black stallion, and rode out toward the Henderson farm. The horse moved with the fluid grace of his wild ancestors, his hooves making barely a whisper against the dry grass. As they traveled, Maria's eyes continuously swept the landscape, reading the story written in bent grass and disturbed earth. About 2 miles from her farm, she found the first sign of trouble. Hoofprints, at least 6 horses, moving fast and heavy. The riders weren't trying to hide their trail, confident in their numbers and firepower. Maria dismounted and knelt beside the tracks, touching the earth with her fingertips. The prints were fresh, made within the last few hours. She followed the trail for another mile before she smelled the smoke more strongly. Cresting a low hill, she saw what remained of the Henderson place. The barn was a skeleton of charred timbers, still smoking. The house had been ransacked, furniture and belongings scattered across the yard like broken toys. But there was no sign of Tom and Martha Henderson or their 2 young children. Maria approached carefully, her hand resting on her gun. The silence was complete except for the crackling of dying fires and the nervous lowing of cattle in the distance. She dismounted and searched the area, finding signs of a struggle near the front door. Boot prints showed where the family had been forced from their home, and the tracks led toward the distant hills where outlaws often made their camps. Behind the ruined barn, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. A child doll dropped and trampled in the dirt. Little Sarah Henderson's favorite toy, the one she carried everywhere. Maria picked up the doll and brushed off the dirt, her jaw tightening with determination. As she stood holding the broken toy, Maria heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. 6 riders were approaching from the west, moving with the casual arrogance of men who feared no pursuit. She quickly led Chief behind the remains of the barn and crouched low, studying the approaching group. The leader was a tall man with a gray beard and hard eyes, his clothes dusty from long riding. The others were mixed lot, young and old, united only by the guns on their hips and the cruel set of their faces. As they drew closer, Maria could hear fragments of their conversation. "Boss says we clear out the whole valley," one of them was saying. "No weaknesses, no complications." "What about that breed woman got the farm to the west?" another asked. "Heard tell she's got some fine horses." The leader spat into the dirt. "We'll pay her a visit next. Probably do her a favor, put her out of her misery. No place for her kind in civilized country anyway." Their laughter carried across the ruined farmyard like the cawing of carrion birds. Maria felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest, a feeling she remembered from her childhood among the Comanche. It was the moment when the hunter became something more dangerous than any prey could imagine. The riders surveyed their handiwork with satisfaction before mounting up and heading toward the hills, following the trail that led to their camp and their captives. Maria waited until they were well out of sight before emerging from her hiding place. She tied the broken doll to her saddle horn, a reminder of why she was about to embark on something that would test every skill her heritage had given her. As the sun reached its peak, Maria mounted Chief and began to follow the Rustlers' trail. But she didn't follow directly. Instead, she used every trick her grandfather had taught her, every lesson learned in a childhood spent learning the ways of the hunter. She moved parallel to their path, staying out of sight while keeping their trail in view. The tracks led into the broken country, where mesas and canyons provided perfect hiding places for men who lived outside the law. Maria knew this land well, had hunted here as a child with her father's people. She knew where water could be found, which paths led to dead ends, and where a single person could move unseen while an army would leave obvious signs of passage. As afternoon faded toward evening, Maria caught sight of smoke rising from a canyon about 3 miles ahead. The Rustlers had made camp for the night, confident that no one would follow them into this maze of stone and shadow. They had no idea that death was already stalking them, patient and silent as a hunting cat. Maria found a sheltered spot among the rocks and made her own camp. She built no fire, ate dried meat and water, and settled down to wait for full darkness. As the stars appeared overhead, she began the ritual preparations her grandfather had taught her so many years ago. She painted her face with clay and charcoal, marking herself as a warrior on the hunt. She checked her weapons one final time, ensuring that every knife was sharp and every bullet was ready. Most importantly, she opened her mind to the teachings of her people, letting herself become something more than just an angry woman seeking justice. The Comanche had a saying, "A warrior's greatest weapon is patience. The hunter who rushes dies hungry. The hunter who waits feeds the whole tribe." Maria Running Wolf had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable. Now she was about to teach these rustlers what it meant to be hunted by someone who could move like a ghost and strike like lightning. As midnight approached, Maria began her descent into the canyon where the rustlers slept. She moved without sound, her moccasined feet finding purchase on rock faces that would have turned back most climbers. Every step was calculated, every movement flowing with the natural rhythm of night hunters. The rustlers' camp was exactly where she had expected it, in a box canyon with a narrow entrance that they believed made them safe. Their horses were picketed near a small spring, while the men slept around a dying fire. Off to one side, she could see the dark shapes of their captives, tied and guarded by a single drowsy sentry. Maria counted 6 sleeping figures plus the guard, 7 against 1, but she had advantages they couldn't imagine. She knew exactly where each man lay, could move without making a sound, and, most importantly, she was fighting for something they couldn't understand. The Rustlers were motivated by greed and cruelty. Maria was motivated by justice and the ancient fury of a mother protecting her cubs. She began with the horses. Moving like a shadow, she reached the picket line and began cutting the ropes that held the animals. But she didn't release them immediately. Instead, she prepared them for what was to come, calming them with whispered words in the language her father had taught her. When the time came, these horses would run, leaving the Rustlers stranded in country that would become their grave. Next, she approached the sleeping men. The first was a young outlaw who had boasted loudest about what they would do to the captured family. Maria's knife found his throat before he could make a sound, sending him into the final darkness with the silence of a hunting cat taking a sleeping bird. The second man was older, grizzled from years of living rough. He stirred as Maria approached, some instinct warning him of danger. His eyes opened just in time to see death descending, but his cry of alarm was cut short by the blade that found his heart. But the third man was a light sleeper, and the slight sound of his companion's last breath woke him instantly. He rolled away from Maria's strike and shouted a warning that rang through the canyon like a gunshot. Suddenly, the camp exploded into chaos as men grabbed for weapons and tried to understand what was happening in the darkness around their dying fire. Maria melted back into the shadows as bullets began flying wildly in all directions. The Rustlers were shooting at phantoms, their muzzle flashes destroying their night vision and making them perfect targets for someone who could see in the dark. She circled the camp like a hunting wolf, picking her shots carefully. Her first bullet took the man who had threatened her farm, the satisfaction of his death burning in her chest like a coal. Her second shot wounded the leader, sending him stumbling into the rocks with a cry of pain and fury. The remaining 3 Rustlers had taken cover and were firing randomly into the darkness, hoping to hit an enemy they couldn't see. But Maria was no longer where they expected her to be. While they focused on the rocks above their camp, she had moved to the canyon mouth, cutting off their escape route. Now she began the part of the hunt that her grandfather had taught her to savor, the slow stalking of cornered prey. "Come out and fight, you coward," the wounded leader shouted into the darkness. "Show yourself if you've got the courage." Maria's answer was a third shot that extinguished the last brand from their fire, plunging the canyon into absolute darkness. Now the hunt would truly begin, and these men would learn what it meant to be prey in the domain of a predator whose people had perfected the art of silent death. The night was young, and Maria Running Wolf had work to do. In the absolute blackness of the canyon, Maria Running Wolf became something her enemies could never have imagined. The Rustlers had grown up thinking darkness was their friend, using night raids and shadow camps to hide their crimes. They had never encountered someone for whom darkness was not merely an ally, but a second skin, worn as naturally as breathing. The wounded leader, Jake Morrison, pressed his hand against the bullet wound in his shoulder and tried to think through the pain. 20 years of outlawry had taught him to read situations quickly, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. Their attacker moved without sound, struck without warning, and seemed to see in absolute darkness. Morrison had fought Indians before, had even tangled with a few Comanche war parties in his younger days, but this felt different, more personal, more deadly. "Collins, you there?" he whispered hoarsely. "Here, boss," came the shaky reply from somewhere to his left. "Martinez got his throat cut. Never made a sound. Just gone." "What about Briggs and Thompson?" "Dead. Both of them. Shot clean through." Collins' voice cracked with fear. "Boss, what we dealing with here? This ain't natural." Morrison had been wondering the same thing. The attack had come with surgical precision, taking out their sentries first, then moving to the sleeping men with the quiet efficiency of a practiced killer. But it was more than just skill. There was something almost supernatural about the way their attacker seemed to know exactly where each man lay, how to move without disturbing even the smallest stone. "Stay calm," Morrison ordered, though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. "It's just one person. Gotta be. We still got them prisoners for bargaining." But when Morrison looked toward where they had left the Henderson family tied near the spring, he saw only empty rope and no sign of the captives. Somehow, in the chaos of the attack, their prisoner had managed to free the family and move them to safety. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They were alone in hostile territory with a killer who knew every inch of the landscape. Maria had indeed freed the Henderson family, leading them to a hidden cave she had discovered as a child. Tom Henderson had been beaten, but was still conscious, while Martha clutched her two children with the desperate strength of a mother protecting her young. The children were terrified but unharmed, their eyes wide with shock at the violence they had witnessed. "Stay here," Maria had told them in a voice that brooked no argument. "Don't make a sound, don't light a fire, don't move until I come back for you. If something happens to me, wait until full daylight, and then follow the canyon east until you reach the main trail." Tom Henderson grabbed her arm as she turned to leave. "Ma'am, there's still 4 of them left. You can't go back there alone." Maria looked into his eyes with a steadiness that reminded him of deep water before a storm. "Mr. Henderson, those men murdered your neighbors and terrorized your family. They were planning to do the same to my farm and every other decent family in this valley. This isn't about courage or foolishness. This is about making sure they never hurt anyone again." She had left them with her spare revolver and enough ammunition to defend themselves if the worst happened. But Maria didn't intend to let it come to that. She had begun something in that canyon that would end only when the last rustler drew his final breath. Now, moving through the darkness with the fluid grace of her Comanche ancestors, Maria began the second phase of her attack. The remaining 4 rustlers had taken defensive positions among the rocks, but they were thinking like white men, forming a perimeter and watching for frontal assault. They didn't understand that they were being hunted by someone who thought like flowing water, finding the weak points in their defense and striking where they least expected. Morrison had positioned himself behind a large boulder, his remaining ammunition laid out where he could reach it quickly. The shoulder wound was worse than he wanted to admit, but he had survived worse. What worried him more was the silence. Their attacker had vanished completely after that last shot, leaving them to wait in darkness that seemed to press against their eyes like a living thing. "I think she's gone," whispered Collins from his position 20 feet away. "Maybe she got what she came for and lit out." "She?" Morrison's voice was sharp. "Had to be a woman, boss. Small and light, moved like one. Besides, who else would care enough about them settlers to track us into hell itself?" Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. A woman. That made sense in a way that terrified him. He had known Comanche women in his time, had seen what they could do when properly motivated. If this was some relative of the people they had been clearing out, if she had some personal stake in protecting these farmers. "We need to move," he decided. "Get back to the horses and ride out of here." "Boss, the horses are gone," came the voice of their youngest member, a kid named Pete who couldn't be more than 19. "Cut loose and scattered. Found the ropes cut clean through." The news hit Morrison like a punch to the gut. Without horses, they were stranded in country that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Worse, they were stranded with a hunter who knew every waterhole, every trail, every place a man might rest or hide. Maria watched them from her perch on the canyon wall, reading their movements through the faint starlight that filtered down from above. She could hear fragments of their conversation, could sense the growing desperation in their voices. Good. Fear would make them careless, and careless men made mistakes. She began to move again, this time along the canyon wall itself, her fingers finding handholds that would have been invisible to anyone else. Years of climbing these cliffs as a child had made the stone as familiar as the rooms of her own house. She knew where each ledge would support her weight, where loose rocks might give way, where shadows would hide her from observation. 20 feet above the rustler's position, Maria found what she was looking for. A section of the canyon wall had been weakened by years of weather, leaving a pile of loose stones balanced precariously above the spot where Morrison and his men had taken cover. All it would take was the right pressure in the right place. She began working carefully, using her knife to pry loose the keystone that held the pile in place. The rock shifted slightly, then held. She applied more pressure, feeling the stone begin to give way. Below her, she could hear Morrison arguing with his men about whether to try moving in the darkness or wait for dawn. "I say we wait," Collins was insisting. "Moving in this darkness, we're likely to walk right into her knife. And if we wait, she picks us off one by one," Morrison replied. "No, we move together, stay close, work our way back toward the canyon mouth." Maria smiled grimly. They would indeed move together, but not in the way they planned. The keystone came free suddenly, and the entire pile of loose rocks began to shift. She pressed herself flat against the canyon wall as tons of stone cascaded down into the Rustlers' position. The rock slide came without warning, a thunderous roar that echoed through the canyon like the voice of an angry god. Morrison dove to one side, feeling stones the size of melons crash into the spot where he had been standing. Collins wasn't fast enough. The largest boulder caught him squarely in the chest, crushing him instantly under its immense weight. When the dust settled, 3 rustlers remained alive, but they were now separated and disoriented. Morrison found himself alone behind a new pile of rubble, while Pete and the 4th man, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, were trapped on the other side of the rockfall. "Boss!" Pete's voice was high with panic. "Boss, you there?" "I'm here," Morrison called back, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. They were trapped in a maze of stone and shadow with a killer who seemed to control the very landscape itself. Maria descended from the canyon wall like a hunting cat, landing silently among the rocks where Hawkins was struggling to free his leg from beneath a fallen stone. The old rustler looked up just in time to see death descending from above, her knife gleaming in the starlight like a falling star. Hawkins died as silently as the others, his body going limp as Maria's blade found its mark. She moved immediately toward Pete's position, knowing that the young rustler's fear would make him dangerous and unpredictable. Pete was crying, though he tried to muffle the sound with his sleeve. At 19, he had thought himself tough enough for the outlaw life, but nothing had prepared him for this nightmare of blood and darkness. He had joined Morrison's gang for the easy money and the excitement, but now he wanted nothing more than to be back home with his mother and sisters. "Please," he whispered when he saw Maria's silhouette approaching through the rubble. "Please, I never killed nobody. I just held the horses. I never hurt them people." Maria studied him for a long moment, seeing in his terrified face the boy he still was beneath the outlaw's facade. For just an instant, she hesitated. Then, she remembered little Sarah Henderson's broken doll, remembered the smoke rising from the destroyed farm, remembered the plans these men had made for her own home. "You chose your companions," she said quietly. "You chose their path." The knife found its mark as precisely as all the others, and Pete's brief life ended among the stones of a canyon that would become his tomb. Maria felt no satisfaction in his death, only the grim necessity of a job that had to be completed. Now only Morrison remained, trapped alone on the far side of the rockfall with his wounded shoulder and his growing desperation. Maria began to work her way around the pile of stone, taking her time. The canyon would hold Morrison securely until she was ready to finish what she had begun. But Morrison was not planning to wait for death to find him. The outlaw leader had survived 20 years by thinking faster and moving quicker than his enemies, and he wasn't ready to die in this godforsaken canyon. He began climbing, using his good arm to pull himself up the rubble pile toward the canyon rim. Every movement sent fire through his wounded shoulder, and loose stones scattered under his boots, but Morrison climbed with the desperation of a man who knew his life depended on reaching high ground. If he could get above his attacker, if he could turn the hunter into the hunted, he might still have a chance. Maria heard him climbing and smiled coldly. Let him reach the canyon rim. Let him think he had found safety in the open country above. The real hunt was just beginning, and Morrison was about to learn that running from a Comanche tracker in her own territory was like trying to outrun the wind itself. The canyon walls echoed with the sound of falling stones as Morrison struggled toward what he hoped would be freedom. He had no way of knowing that he was climbing toward a fate far worse than a quick death in the darkness below. Maria Running Wolf had been patient this long. She could afford to be patient a little longer. The night was far from over, and the lesson she was teaching would echo through these hills long after the last echo of gunfire had faded into memory. Jake Morrison hauled himself over the canyon rim just as the eastern sky began to show the first pale hint of dawn. His shoulder blazed with pain, blood had soaked through his shirt, and his hands were torn raw from clawing at stone and root during his desperate climb. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was out of that death trap of the canyon. The outlaw leader paused to catch his breath and assess his situation. His horse was gone, his men were dead, and somewhere below him moved a killer who seemed to command the very landscape itself. Morrison had faced long odds before, but never anything like this. Still, he was alive when better men had died, and he intended to stay that way. The open country stretched endlessly in all directions, broken by occasional mesas and dry creek beds. Morrison knew this territory well enough to find water and eventually make his way to one of the outlaw towns that dotted the borderlands. All he had to do was stay ahead of his pursuer long enough to reach help. He began walking east toward the distant settlement of Perdition Creek, where a man with gold in his pockets could buy protection and no questions were asked. It was maybe 30 miles as the crow flies, but in his wounded condition, it would take him the better part of 2 days. Morrison settled into the steady pace of a man who had learned to cover ground on foot, favoring his wounded shoulder, but moving with purpose. Behind him, Maria emerged from the canyon like a ghost materializing from shadow. She moved to the spot where Morrison had climbed out and knelt to examine the signs he had left. Blood drops on the stone told her his wound was worse than he probably realized. Scuff marks and broken fingernails spoke of desperation and pain. The direction of his tracks pointed toward the Badlands where outlaws traditionally sought refuge. Maria smiled grimly. Morrison was thinking like a white man, heading for the safety of civilization and numbers. But there would be no safety for him anywhere in this vast country. She would follow him across every mile, through every hardship, until justice was served. She returned briefly to the hidden cave where the Henderson family waited, bringing them water and the last of her dried meat. Tom Henderson was looking better, though his face still showed the purple bruises where the Rustlers had beaten him. Martha held her children close, their eyes bright with fever and exhaustion. "Is it over?" Martha asked, searching Maria's face for reassurance. "Almost," Maria replied. "One got away, but not for long. You'll be safe here until I return. Keep the gun close and trust no one until you see me again." She left them with directions to the nearest town and enough supplies to last several days. If something happened to her during the hunt, they would at least have a chance to reach safety. But Maria didn't intend to let anything happen to her. She had work to finish. By full sunrise, Maria was on Morrison's trail, moving with the tireless pace her grandfather had taught her. The Comanche could cover vast distances on foot when necessary, running from dawn to dusk without stopping for rest. It was a skill that had allowed her people to survive in harsh country where other tribes faltered. Morrison's tracks were easy to follow at first. The wounded man was bleeding steadily, leaving a trail of dark spots on the stone that guided Maria forward like a map. But more than blood, she could read the story of his journey in 1,000 subtle signs. The length of his stride told her his pace. The depth of his footprints revealed his weight and burden. The spacing of his rest stops showed her his growing exhaustion. By mid-morning, Morrison realized he was being followed. When he stopped to rest in the shade of a twisted juniper tree, he looked back and saw a distant figure moving steadily in his direction. Even at that distance, he could tell it was the same person who had destroyed his gang. She moved with a fluid efficiency that covered ground faster than seemed possible. Morrison forced himself to his feet and began moving faster, ignoring the fire in his shoulder and the growing weakness in his legs. But every time he looked back, the figure seemed closer. She wasn't running, wasn't even walking particularly fast, but she gained ground with each hour that passed. The psychological pressure began to wear on Morrison more than the physical pain. He had been in running fights before, had been chased by posses and bounty hunters across half of Texas. But those pursuits had eventually ended when his trackers gave up or lost the trail. This was different. This felt inevitable, like being stalked by death itself. As the sun reached its peak, Morrison began making mistakes that only made his situation worse. He left the main game trails and struck out across rough country, thinking to lose his pursuer in the maze of arroyos and boulder fields. Instead, he only slowed his own progress while making his trail easier to follow in the soft earth between the rocks. Maria read his desperation in every panicked turn and desperate shortcut. Morrison was thinking like prey now, making the errors that prey always made when the hunter drew close. He was using energy he couldn't spare and traveling routes that would tire him faster while gaining him nothing. She began to close the distance deliberately, letting Morrison see her more often, letting the knowledge of pursuit eat away at his resolve. The Comanche had understood psychological warfare long before white men gave it a name. Sometimes breaking an enemy's spirit was more effective than breaking his body. By afternoon, Morrison was stumbling more often, his wounded shoulder leaving him off balance and weak. The blood loss was taking its toll, and Dehydration made his head swim with every step. When he crested a low hill and saw his pursuer no more than a half-mile behind him, clearly visible in the harsh afternoon light, he nearly broke down entirely. She looked like something from a nightmare, her face painted with clay and charcoal in patterns that spoke of war and death. Her long black hair streamed behind her as she moved, and, even at that distance, Morrison could see the cold determination in her eyes. This was no mere woman seeking justice. This was vengeance given human form. Morrison forced himself to keep moving, but his pace was slowing with each mile. He began dropping equipment to lighten his load. First his extra ammunition, then his heavy gun belt, finally, even his boots when the leather began to chafe his feet raw. Each discarded item was another small victory for his pursuer, another sign that the hunted was beginning to break. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Morrison reached a decision born of desperation. He couldn't outrun his pursuer, and he couldn't hide from someone who seemed to read tracks like words on a page. His only chance was to make a stand, to use what advantages he still possessed to even the odds. He chose his ground carefully, a cluster of red sandstone boulders that offered cover and commanded a view of the surrounding area. Morrison positioned himself where he could see anyone approaching from below, checked his remaining ammunition, and settled in to wait. If his pursuer wanted to finish this, she would have to come to him. Maria saw Morrison take his defensive position and nodded approvingly. The outlaw leader was finally thinking like a warrior instead of fleeing criminal. This would make the ending more satisfying. She circled his position at a distance, studying the terrain and planning her approach. The boulder field offered good defensive positions, but it also provided numerous routes of attack for someone who understood how to move unseen. Maria had been hunting in country like this since she was old enough to hold a bow. As darkness began to gather, Maria made her own preparations. She gathered materials for the psychological warfare that would precede the final assault, stones that would ring against rock with an eerie persistence, dried brush that would rustle with sounds like approaching footsteps, pieces of reflective stone that would catch what little light remained and create the illusion of movement where none existed. Morrison huddled behind his chosen boulder, rifle ready and eyes straining to penetrate the growing darkness. He had perhaps 6 shots left, and he would have to make each one count. Somewhere in the gathering shadows, death was preparing to pay him a visit. The first stone struck the rocks above Morrison's head just as full darkness settled over the landscape. The sharp crack echoed through the boulder field like a gunshot, making him jump and nearly fire at shadows. A minute later, another stone struck from a different direction, then another. Maria was announcing her presence, letting Morrison know that she was all around him, that his defensive position was already compromised. The psychological assault continued as dried brush rustled with sounds that could have been footsteps or could have been wind. Flashes of reflected light appeared and vanished like watching eyes. Morrison fired twice at shadows that turned out to be nothing, wasting precious ammunition on phantoms. His nerves were stretched to the breaking point, and sweat ran down his face despite the coolness of the desert night. "Come on," he shouted into the darkness. "Quit playing games and face me like a man." Maria's laughter drifted through the rocks like the sound of wind chimes made from human bones. "I'm not a man." Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "I'm what you made me when you killed innocent people and threatened my home." Morrison spun toward the sound of her voice, but she was no longer there. The disembodied words seemed to come from the very stones themselves, echoing and re-echoing until he couldn't tell where they originated. "You want to know who I am?" Maria's voice continued, now seeming to come from directly behind him. "I'm the granddaughter of Running Bear, who took 100 scalps in defense of his people. I am the daughter of Swift Eagle, who could track a wounded deer for 3 days without rest. I am the widow of Samuel Running Wolf, who taught me that some fights are worth any price." Morrison whirled again, firing wildly at the sound of her voice. The bullet sparked off stone and ricocheted into the darkness, accomplishing nothing except to waste another precious shot. "And I am the woman whose friends you murdered today," Maria concluded, her voice now a whisper that seemed to come from inside Morrison's own head. "I am your death, Jake Morrison, and I have been patient enough." The final assault came with the silence of falling snow and the inevitability of sunrise. Maria flowed through the boulder field like water through stone, using every shadow and crevice to mask her approach. Morrison heard nothing until her hand closed around his throat from behind, cutting off his scream before it could begin. The knife found its mark with the precision of all the others, and Jake Morrison's 20 years of outlawry came to an end among the red rocks of a country that had never truly been his to claim. His last thought was that he should have listened to his mother all those years ago when she warned him that evil always finds its way home in the end. Maria cleaned her knife on Morrison's shirt and stood looking down at the last of the rustlers. The long hunt was finally over, but she felt no triumph, only the weary satisfaction of a job completed. Justice had been served, but at a cost she was only beginning to understand. She gathered Morrison's remaining possessions, his rifle, his small bag of gold coins, and a letter from someone named Sarah who still believed he might someday come home to marry her. Maria would see that the letter found its way to the proper authorities. Someone should know that Sarah's long wait was finally over. As dawn broke over the boulder field, Maria began the long journey back to collect the Henderson family and see them safely to town. After that, she would return to her farm and try to rebuild the peace that had been shattered by greed and violence. But she would never again be quite the same woman who had stepped on her porch that morning to drink coffee and watch the sunrise. The hunt had awakened something in her that would never fully sleep again. Maria Running Wolf had become something more dangerous than any of her enemies could have imagined, and the word of what she had done would spread through the outlaw community like wildfire. There would be other threats, other men who thought a lone woman was easy prey. But they would learn, as Morrison and his gang had learned, that some prey is more dangerous than any predator. In the Badlands of Texas, a new legend was being born, written in blood and carved in stone. 3 days after the hunt ended in the boulder field, Maria Running Wolf led the Henderson family into the town of Cedar Springs, their clothes dusty and their faces marked by the ordeal they had survived. The small frontier settlement buzzed with activity as word spread that the missing family had been found alive and their captors dealt with in the most final way possible. Sheriff Tom Bradley was a weathered man in his 50s who had seen enough violence to recognize its aftermath when it walked through his door. He studied Maria with careful eyes as she helped Martha Henderson down from the borrowed horse they had found wandering near the canyon. The woman's face was painted with traces of clay and charcoal that hadn't quite washed away, and she moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to danger. "Mrs. Running Wolf," Bradley said, touching his hat brim in greeting. "Heard tell you found the Hendersons. Also heard tell of some trouble out at their place." Maria met his gaze steadily. 6 men attacked their farm, burned the buildings, took the family captive. The men won't be troubling anyone anymore. The sheriff absorbed this information without visible emotion, but Maria could see the questions forming behind his eyes. Bradley had been a lawman long enough to read between the lines of what she wasn't saying. 6 armed men against 1 woman, and somehow she was the one standing here alive. "Reckon I should ride out and have a look at what's left," Bradley said finally. "Might be bodies need burying, evidence needs collecting. You'll find what's left of Morrison's gang scattered between the Henderson place and Devil's Canyon," Maria replied. "They made their choices. The consequences caught up with them." Tom Henderson stepped forward, still favoring the ribs that had been cracked during his beating. "Sheriff, this woman saved our lives. If it wasn't for her, we'd all be dead by now. My Martha and the children they'd have." He couldn't finish the sentence, but the sheriff understood. Bradley had seen what men like Morrison's gang did to families they considered inconvenient. The fact that the Hendersons were alive and relatively unharmed spoke volumes about both Maria's skill and her determination. "Anyone else I should know about?" Bradley asked. "Any other ranches hit? Any other families missing?" Maria shook her head. Morrison said they were clearing the valley, but his gang was small. 6 men total. They started with isolated places, planning to work their way through all the homesteads. They won't be finishing that work. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Appreciate what you did, Mrs. Running Wolf. Territory's got enough problems without organized gangs terrorizing honest folks. You did what needed doing. There was no formal recognition, no ceremony or reward. In frontier justice, sometimes a job well done was its own acknowledgement." Maria helped get the Henderson family settled with temporary lodging at the town's small hotel, accepted the sheriff's offer to send word to relatives in Kansas who could help them rebuild, and prepared to return to her own farm. But before she could leave town, word of what had happened began to spread in the way that news traveled in small communities. The story grew with each telling, becoming something larger and more mythic than the grim reality of blood and death in dark places. At Murphy's Saloon, cowboys and drifters gathered around tables sticky with spilled beer to hear first-hand accounts from anyone who had seen Maria arrive with the rescued family. The details became more elaborate with each drink consumed and each retelling. Heard she tracked them Rustlers for 3 days without stopping. Claimed a grizzled ranch hand named Pete Williamson. Never slept, never ate, just followed them like some kind of ghost. My cousin's boys saw the bodies, added another drinker. Said they was killed with knives, mostly real quiet-like. Takes skill to kill 6 armed men without waking the neighbors. An old-timer named Jonas Creek, who had fought Indians in his younger days, shook his head knowingly. Comanche blood will tell. Them people could track a whisper through a thunderstorm and kill a man so quiet his horse wouldn't spook. Rustlers picked the wrong woman to mess with. The stories reached other ears as well. In the network of criminal enterprises that operated in the borderlands, word traveled fast when an entire gang disappeared overnight. Morrison had been known among the outlaw community as a careful, successful operator. If someone could take down his entire crew single-handed, that someone represented a new and dangerous variable in the equation. 2 days' ride from Cedar Springs, in the outlaw town of Perdition Creek, Black Pete Alvarez received the news with the kind of attention he usually reserved for reports of cavalry movements or territorial marshals. Alvarez ran one of the largest criminal organizations in the territory, and Morrison's gang had been working under his loose protection. "You sure about this?" he asked the nervous messenger who had brought the word. "Morrison and all his boys dead?" "Saw the bodies myself, boss," the man replied. "Sheriff Bradley's got them laid out behind his office, waiting for the territorial authorities. All 6 of them, neat as you please. Throats cut mostly, couple shot." Alvarez leaned back in his chair and considered the implications. Morrison had been useful, but not irreplaceable. What concerned him more was the precedent. If word got around that a single person could wipe out an entire gang, it might give ideas to other folks who had grievances with his operations. "This woman," he said finally. "What's her story?" "Name's Maria Running Wolf. Part Comanche, part Mexican. Runs a small farm about 10 miles west of Cedar Springs. Widow woman. Keeps to herself mostly." "Not anymore. She don't," Alvarez observed. "Woman who can do what she done. She's past keeping to herself. Question is, what does she want to do next?" It was a good question, and one that Maria herself was pondering as she rode Chief back toward her farm through the golden light of late afternoon. The familiar landscape should have brought comfort after the violence of the past few days, but instead she felt a restless energy that hadn't been there before. The hunt had awakened something in her that she had thought buried with her father's people. During her marriage to Samuel, she had tried to live the life of a peaceful farmer's wife, putting aside the warrior traditions of her childhood. But when real danger threatened everything she cared about, those old skills had emerged stronger than ever. Her farm looked exactly as she had left it, but Maria saw it now with different eyes. The neat fields and sturdy buildings represented everything she had built with Samuel's help, but they also represented a kind of target. Any organized group of criminals looking to control the territory would eventually come for isolated homesteads like hers. She tended to Chief and Thunder, checking them carefully for any signs of injury or illness. The horses had been her lifeline during the hunt, and she owed them more care than ever. As she worked, Maria found herself planning improvements to the farm's defenses that she had never considered before. The house needed better sight lines to the main approaches. The barn could be modified to provide defensive positions if necessary. Most importantly, she needed to think about early warning systems that would give her time to prepare for future threats. That evening, as Maria sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of red and gold, she became aware that she was not entirely alone. A rider was approaching from the direction of town, moving at the steady pace of someone on official business. Sheriff Bradley rode into her yard just as the last light was fading from the western sky. He dismounted carefully, showing the effects of his age and long years in the saddle, and accepted Maria's offer of coffee and a place to sit. "Thought you should know," he said after they had settled into the wooden chairs Samuel had built for the porch. "Been getting reports from other areas. Seems Morrison's gang wasn't the only group operating in this part of the territory. Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. How many others? Hard to say for certain. Maybe 3 or 4 organized gangs, plus the usual collection of drifters and small-time thieves. Point is, word's gotten around about what happened to Morrison's boys. Some folks are taking it as a warning to stay clear of this valley. Others see it as a challenge, Maria finished. Bradley nodded grimly. Territory's changing, Mrs. Running Wolf. Used to be outlaws could find empty country to hide in, places where they wouldn't run into civilized folks. But settlements are spreading, railroads are coming through, and that means less room for the kind of men who live outside the law. So they'll try to carve out territory where they can control things, Maria said, understanding the implications immediately. Like this valley. Exactly. And after what you did to Morrison, some of them are going to see you as either a threat that needs eliminating or a weapon they'd like to control. Maria sipped her coffee and considered this unwelcome news. She had acted to protect her neighbors and her own farm, but in doing so, she had drawn attention from forces larger and more dangerous than a single gang of rustlers. What do you recommend, Sheriff? Bradley was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkness that had settled over the valley. Officially, I'd recommend you consider relocating somewhere safer, maybe back east where you got family. And unofficially? The sheriff smiled grimly. Unofficially, I think this valley needs someone like you. Someone who understands that sometimes the law can't reach far enough or fast enough to protect decent folks. Someone willing to do what needs doing when the time comes. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who understood the harsh realities of frontier life. Finally, Bradley stood to leave, pausing at the porch steps to deliver one last piece of information. There's talk that Black Pete Alvarez is planning to move some of his operations this direction. If that's true, what you face with Morrison's gang will look like a church social by comparison. Alvarez has maybe 30 or 40 men working for him, and they're not the kind to be taken by surprise in a canyon. After the sheriff rode away, Maria remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds of her valley and thinking about the choices that lay ahead. She could indeed pack up and leave, find somewhere safe and anonymous to rebuild her life. Samuel would have wanted her to choose safety over danger. But Samuel was gone, and the woman who had emerged from the hunt in Devil's Canyon was not the same person who had tried to live quietly as a farmer's widow. That woman had discovered something about herself that couldn't be ignored or set aside. Maria Running Wolf had found her calling, and it wasn't tending crops or raising cattle. She was a guardian, a protector of those who couldn't protect themselves. In a land where justice often came at the point of a gun, she had become something rare and valuable. She would stay. She would defend her valley and her people. And when Black Pete Alvarez or anyone like him came calling, they would learn the same lesson that Morrison's gang had learned in the darkness of Devil's Canyon. Some prey is more dangerous than any predator, and some women are more deadly than any army. 6 weeks after the destruction of Morrison's gang, Black Pete Alvarez arrived in the valley with 25 men and a plan to establish permanent control over the territory. He had spent those weeks gathering information about the woman who had killed 6 of his associates, and what he learned both impressed and concerned him. Maria Running Wolf was not just a skilled fighter, but a tactical genius who understood the landscape and the people with an intimacy that made her nearly impossible to surprise or outmaneuver. More troubling for Alvarez's plans, she had become something of a legend among the honest settlers, who now looked to her as their unofficial protector. The criminal leader had considered several approaches to dealing with the threat she represented. A direct assault on her farm would likely succeed due to sheer numbers, but it would also make enemies of every decent family in the valley. A more subtle approach might work better, isolating her from support, cutting her off from supplies and information, then moving in when she was weakened and alone. Alvarez established his base camp in an abandoned mine complex 30 miles north of Cedar Springs, far enough from town to avoid immediate attention, but close enough to strike quickly when the time came. His men began systematic raids on outlying farms and ranches, not to destroy but to intimidate and control. The message was clear: cooperate with Black Pete's organization or face escalating consequences. Most of the valley's residents had families to protect and livelihoods to preserve. Paying protection money seemed preferable to risking the kind of destruction that had befallen the Hendersons. But Maria had other ideas. She began by establishing an intelligence network among the valley's residents, teaching them how to recognize signs of approaching trouble and how to send warning signals across long distances using mirror flashes and smoke. The system was based on Comanche communication methods that could relay information faster than any horse could carry it. When Alvarez's men hit the Morrison Ranch, no relation to the dead outlaw leader, they found the buildings empty and the valuable livestock mysteriously absent. By the time they realized they had been anticipated, Maria was already in position to ambush their retreat. 3 of Alvarez's men died in that ambush, cut down by precise rifle fire from concealed positions that seemed to be everywhere at once. The survivors brought back reports of an attack by multiple shooters who had vanished like smoke when they tried to pursue. In reality, Maria had acted alone, using her mobility and knowledge of the terrain to create the illusion of a larger force. She had learned from her grandfather that psychological warfare was often more effective than direct confrontation, especially when facing superior numbers. The pattern continued for 3 weeks. Every time Alvarez's men tried to establish control over part of the valley, they found their targets warned and prepared. Supply raids yielded empty warehouses. Kidnapping attempts found only abandoned buildings. And always, there were the mysterious attacks that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Alvarez began to lose men to desertion as word spread that the valley was protected by some kind of supernatural force. Cowboys and gunfighters would face down armed posses, and cavalry units found themselves spooked by an enemy they couldn't see or predict. "It's like fighting a ghost," complained one of his lieutenants, a scarred veteran named Knife Johnson. "She knows where we're going before we do, hits us when we least expect it, then disappears before we can strike back." Alvarez studied the map of the valley spread across his camp table, marking the locations of successful attacks and failed raids. A pattern was emerging, one that showed impressive strategic thinking. His opponent wasn't just reacting to his moves, she was anticipating them, thinking several steps ahead. "She's good," he admitted grudgingly. "Better than Morrison ever was, better than most military officers I've known. But she's still just one person, and one person can't be everywhere at once." His solution was to abandon subtle tactics in favor of overwhelming force. Instead of small raids designed to intimidate, he would strike multiple targets simultaneously with large groups of men. Even Maria Running Wolf couldn't respond to 6 different attacks happening at the same time. The plan was sound in theory, but it overlooked one crucial factor. Maria was no longer acting alone. Over the weeks of defending the valley, she had quietly recruited and trained a core group of volunteers from among the local population. Tom Henderson recovered from his injuries and burning for revenge against the men who had threatened his family. Young Billy Martinez, whose father's ranch had been one of the first targets of Alvarez's intimidation campaign. Sarah Chun, the Chinese shopkeeper's daughter who had learned to shoot defending her family's store from drunken cowboys. None of them were professional fighters, but they were motivated by something more powerful than money or adventure. They were defending their homes and families against men who would destroy everything they had worked to build. Maria had trained them well, teaching them to move quietly, shoot accurately, and, most importantly, to think like hunters rather than prey. When Alvarez finally launched his coordinated attack on 6 different targets across the valley, he found organized resistance waiting at each location. The battle for the valley began at dawn on a cold December morning. Alvarez's men rode hard toward their assigned targets, confident that their numerical superiority would carry the day. Instead, they rode into carefully planned ambushes that had been weeks in the making. At the Chun family store, Sarah and her father held off 8 attackers from reinforced positions they had prepared in advance. At the Martinez ranch, Billy and his brothers turned their barn into a fortress that controlled the only approach to their property. Similar scenes played out across the valley as ordinary people proved they could be extraordinary when defending what mattered most to them. But the main attack came at Maria's farm, where Alvarez himself led 15 men in an assault designed to end her threat permanently. They approached at first light, spreading out to surround the buildings before closing in for the kill. Maria was waiting for them. She had spent weeks preparing her farm for siege, turning it into a carefully designed killing field. Hidden rifle pits commanded every approach. The barn had been reinforced with steel plates salvaged from abandoned mining equipment. Most importantly, she had prepared multiple escape routes that would allow her to retreat and return when circumstances favored her. The battle began when Alvarez's men emerged from the pre-dawn darkness, expecting to find a sleeping woman unprepared for their assault. Instead, they walked into crossfire from positions they hadn't known existed. Maria's first shots dropped 2 men before the others even realized they were under attack. "Take cover," Alvarez shouted, diving behind the water trough as bullets whined through the air around him. "She's dug in like a tick. Spread out and find those rifle pits." But finding the positions was easier said than done. Maria had camouflaged her defensive works so well that they were invisible until muzzle flashes revealed their locations. Worse for the attackers, she moved constantly, firing from one position before shifting to another, creating the impression of multiple defenders. For 2 hours, the battle raged across Maria's farm with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Alvarez lost 3 more men to Maria's precise shooting, but his numbers allowed him to keep pressure on her positions and gradually work closer to the house. Then, the sound of additional gunfire erupted from the direction of town, followed by the rapid approach of mounted riders. Sheriff Bradley was leading a hastily assembled posse of townspeople and volunteers from the valley's other successful defenses. Seeing that his coordinated attack had failed and that reinforcements were arriving for his enemies, Alvarez made the hardest decision of his criminal career. He ordered a retreat, abandoning his dead and wounded in his haste to escape with what remained of his force. "This ain't over," he shouted toward the farm as his surviving men gathered their horses. "I'll be back with a real army. You can't hide behind luck forever." Maria's response was a bullet that passed close enough to Alvarez's ear that he could feel the wind of its passage. The outlaw leader spurred his horse toward the distant hills, his dreams of controlling the valley evaporating like morning mist. In the aftermath of the battle, the valley's residents gathered at Maria's farm to tend wounds and count the cost of their victory. 7 of Alvarez's men lay dead, while the defenders had suffered only minor injuries. More importantly, they had proven that organized resistance could defeat even a large criminal organization. "Reckon word of this will spread pretty quick," Sheriff Bradley observed as he helped Maria reload ammunition that had been expended during the fight. "Other outlaw gangs will think twice before trying to muscle in on territory that fights back this hard." Maria nodded, but her expression remained serious. "Alvarez will be back, probably with more men. This was just the first test." "Maybe," the sheriff replied. "But next time, he'll face more than just you and your neighbors. Territory's changing, like I said before. People are getting tired of being pushed around by thugs and killers. What you've done here, it's going to inspire others." Over the following months, Sheriff Bradley's prediction proved accurate. Word of the valley's successful defense spread throughout the territory, encouraging other communities to organize their own resistance against criminal organizations. Maria found herself consulted by settlements across Texas and neighboring territories, teaching others how to prepare defenses and coordinate responses to outlaw threats. The woman who had once wanted only to live quietly on her farm had become something larger than herself. She was a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to be victims, when they chose to fight for their homes and families instead of submitting to those who would prey upon them. Black Pete Alvarez never returned to challenge the valley's defenders. His organization, weakened by casualties and desertions, eventually collapsed when other communities began implementing Maria's defensive strategies. The outlaw leader himself disappeared into Mexico, his dreams of criminal empire reduced to cautionary tales told around campfires. As spring returned to the valley, bringing new growth and fresh hope, Maria Running Wolf stood once again on her porch watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and promise. The woman who gazed out over the peaceful landscape was not the same person who had faced Morrison's gang in the darkness of Devil's Canyon, but she was exactly who she needed to be. She had found her calling as a guardian and protector, had discovered that some fights truly were worth any price. The valley was safe, her neighbors could sleep peacefully, and children could play in fields that were no longer shadowed by the threat of violence. In the distance, Maria could see other farms and ranches beginning to stir with the activities of a new day. Smoke rose from kitchen chimneys as families prepared breakfast. Cattle moved through pastures where grass grew green and thick. Children ran to do morning chores, their laughter carrying across the clean morning air. It was worth everything she had sacrificed, every risk she had taken, every enemy she had faced. This peaceful valley, these good people, this chance for families to build something lasting and beautiful, this was what she had fought to preserve. Maria, running wolf, smiled and went inside to start her own breakfast. Outside, Chief and Thunder grazed contentedly in the pasture, their ears alert but relaxed. The weapons that had saved the valley were cleaned and stored but ready if needed. And somewhere in the house where she had learned to love and to hope, a widow who had become a warrior prepared to enjoy another day of the peace she had earned with blood and courage in the darkness where justice was born. The legend would grow with each telling, but the woman at its heart would continue to live quietly on her farm, tending her crops and her horses, watching over her valley with eyes that missed nothing and a heart that would never again allow evil to flourish where good people tried to build their dreams.